The smoother gaming on Ryzen is due to it having 8 cores and 16 threads. Gaming is faster and smoother. Daily activities are hassle-free. Do your games feel buttery smooth with Ryzen 3rd Gen? Ryzen smoother for gaming? Lower frame timings on Ryzen. Intel CPUs stutter and frame skip, resulting in less of a smother, snappier experience. Would Ryzen give a smoother experience without the stutter? Courtesy of internet commenters, that's the story we're looking at today. So this one's run away a bit, and the plot has gotten somewhat lost in that people upgrading from an old Intel CPU to a new AMD Ryzen CPU are experiencing, in most cases, a better overall gaming experience. But those upgrades are not often done alongside a new Intel CPU as well. And that's where there's some detail lost in the discussion of, is Ryzen smoother for gaming? So this is something we've seen discussed a lot online, and we thought, it's probably time to just put some numbers to this and objectively look at some of the claims. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX. The PureBase 500DX is a new push from Be Quiet into mesh-fronted cases that are more thermally focused. The 500DX maintains high build quality and attention to detail for its dust filters, front panel installation, and fan placement, and still has additional focus on noise control. The case comes with 3 140mm PureWanes 2 fans stock and has RGB LEDs, but with a physical hardware switch for easy control. Learn more about the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX at the link in the description below. Despite some of those quotes earlier sounding like infomercials, it's actually what people have said, and that kind of comment is all over the place now. So, a couple things here. First of all, Ryzen is not just universally smoother than Intel. It's not really that simple. But that's where the train has gotten off the rails and headed to instead. Typically, the experience of gaming feeling quote-unquote smoother, which we'll discuss in a moment, comes from upgrading the system overall. That could be the OS upgrade. The environment gets dirtied, slow, and filled with crap as you use it for, say, 5 years on your previous build. That alone will improve the experience. Comes from improving to any new CPU, at least within a reasonable budget. And those are the two items that, alongside changes in other things, like just even potentially the entire Windows OS could be different from 7 to 10 or something, that's where the detail is getting lost. When someone says, I upgraded to a 3600 from a 2600K, from a 4690K, and my experience feels better. That's probably accurate. And in our testing, we've shown that it is in almost every case. But then the follow-on comments that then propagate this statement everywhere are simply, Ryzen is smoother for gaming. So before we get into the numbers here, let's start off with the word smoother. Smoother doesn't actually mean anything. It doesn't have an objective definition in any sense. People often use this word in the subjective, and what they actually mean, if we translate it into empirical data, would typically be the perception that frame times are more consistent. So that would be the frame-to-frame interval, the frame pacing. The time from one frame to the next is either more consistent or is minimally less spotty, less dotted with frame time spikes that might be an excursion from the mean of, say, 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds higher than whatever the mean is from the previous set of frames. If we were going to try and assign a set of numbers or a chart to the word smoother when people talk about it, that chart, and this is what most of this video would be a chart of the frame-to-frame time for every single, so the time required to draw each frame as we see it appear on the screen. We're going to use on present for this as opposed to on display, but you can tap into the OS and fetch this data and get a present time for the frames coming out. 60 FPS, 16.667 milliseconds, for example. Frame rate is kind of a weird, funny metric anyway. It's an abstraction from the base metric of time. And in some senses, it doesn't always mean something, because if you really think about it, if you try to go full philosophy on it, and you start thinking about what is FPS, when you're playing a game and you have a number on the screen that says 65 FPS, what does that really mean? Over what period of time? What are we looking at? And the answer is, in a lot of cases, what it's really doing is it's taking the time required to draw the frame that you're looking at. And then after that, you're turning it into a rate by dividing for milliseconds. So that's really what frame rate means. And if you really think about it, 60 FPS measured over a period of one frame is kind of a silly thing. And we do throw in things like 1% lows, 0.1% lows to try and help show the points where there is frame time deviation, but ultimately you do need to get back to the base metric of time if you want to really understand this particular story or one like it. 1%, 0.1% helps a lot in showing these things, but you do miss some data because naturally you're averaging over things. So that's what we're looking at today. We need to really set the scope for this piece and narrow it down to make it achievable within half an hour. Reference points for some of our previous work would include an old multitasking content piece where people asked us, but is Ryzen better when you multitask? And we already looked at that. It's a complicated thing to look at. Today, we're just focusing on the phrasing Ryzen is smoother as a universal global phrase as applied to gaming. When it comes to multitasking, as people like to call it, we'll have some data in here that represents bits and pieces of that, but that is a much wider scope. We shouldn't have to say this either, but unfortunately, AMD's hardcore fan base is extremely sensitive to any criticism of AMD, so we do need to lay out some credentials. That fan base often doesn't know our previous posting history beyond the laziest search or the most inflammatory thing. While we've been critical of AMD in the past, often heavily so, we've also been critical of Intel and MSI recently. We're going to flash through a couple of thumbnails from each vendor just to prove the point, and we've also, especially recently, listed AMD, by the way, in our highest recommendations in workstation and all-around use cases, like in our 2019 Best CPU Awards show and our 2020 Best CPU So Far Awards show. That said, AMD isn't always the right choice, and the sooner its hardcore downvote happy fans learn that, the better for everybody. AMD will turn into the mid-2010s Intel without sufficient competition, as any company would, because why would you try harder? Getting into this then, the goal is not to tear down AMD in any way, it's to just set the expectations, get everyone back to reality on what's the empirical data say. People who want the statement to be true will see that in some cases it in fact is, but it's not universally true. In a real user environment, people aren't upgrading to both a new AMD and a new Intel system at the same time, or they lack other modern components within the upgrade. So you're changing the entire system, includes GPU, memory, everything else, but most importantly, unless you're upgrading to both a 3600 and a 10600K and then benchmarking it in a controlled fashion, you don't really have the full picture. So yes, anything from an older CPU would look good. And this is why some of this propagates. So if you've upgraded and you're seeing that the experience is smoother, the only real conclusion that can be drawn is my new computer is better than my old computer. And a lot of people we've seen online do draw that conclusion. That's completely fine. It's the follow-ons that say it's because of Ryzen where it gets muddied. So let's explore this side of things first. We're going to look at old data first. So Intel 4000 series CPUs, we're looking at CPUs from 2014 or so, and upgrades to 2019 or 2020 parts, and that'll set the stage for that aspect of it, the upgrade. Then we'll look at the software side of things, and then we're going to look at the head-to-head modern AMD and Intel CPUs for purely frame time performance at rough price equivalents. That's what we're really looking at for the most part is going to be price-to-price part comparisons to make it the most sensible way possible for the real user. We'll start with the frame time plot of Red Dead Redemption 2, since that's one of the newest games out for PC right now. That'll compound the differences as well, given that game software changes in the last 6 years have been pretty significant. Here, the Intel i5 4690K, which truly was enough for gaming when it launched, is showing overall consistent frame times, at least insofar as the frame-to-frame interval, but it also shows some large spikes when the system load shifts more heavily towards the CPU and off of the other components. We see that especially at the 900-second mark, where our average frame-to-frame interval spikes from 13 milliseconds to about 20 to 22. There are a few spikes in here as well that approach the threshold of being noticeable stutters in gameplay, which is more than can be said for the much more consistent and modern Intel i5 10600K from this year. The frame-to-frame excursions never exceed about 5 milliseconds for the CPU, which is well below the 8 to 12 millisecond noticeable threshold that we've typically outlined. AMD's R5 3600XT also sees a reduction in the maximum excursion from the mean frame time, although its peak-to-peak range is wider than the 10600K, or in some cases, even the 4690K. In this sense, the 3600XT isn't ever smoother than the 10600K, but it's less variable when the going gets tough than the 4690K when it encounters more core-intensive workloads. Before anyone argues price, even the 3900X produces a similar wave, and the 10600K still leads that. AMD's architecture doesn't really scale higher-end CPUs to improve in big ways for gaming. That's more of a production side thing, and it definitely gets acclaim for that. But for people who have been maybe out of the game for a little while, buying a 3900X or XT doesn't really guarantee you better gaming performance than, say, a 3600 or even a 3300X. That's not how AMD's architecture typically works out. This next chart is for Total War 3 Kingdoms, a modern Total War title that has objectively increased its reliance on threads as compared to Total War Warhammer 2. This helps establish the old to new improvement even better. Remember, the point of showing these is to establish the premise that anyone moving from a sufficiently old Intel CPU to a modern CPU from either AMD or Intel would be of the opinion that the new product is quote-unquote smoother. But this doesn't mean that the new Intel product isn't also smoother, just that anything near original expenditure would be, if bought today. Anyway, here's the chart. The 4790K did well, given its age, and we showed previously that the 8-thread counterpart to the 4690K really did offer a lot of later life value over the gaming targeted i5. That's in our previous content though. What we want you to pay attention to today is the size of these lines, or the apparent height difference from one interval to the next. With the 4790K, standard deviation was 1.93 milliseconds, with the max value at 22.3 milliseconds, the minimum value at 6.5 milliseconds, and the average frame-to-frame interval at 9.9 milliseconds. The biggest peak-to-peak deviation was 22.3 milliseconds down to 9.6 milliseconds in the subsequent frame. That's about a 13 millisecond delta frame-to-frame at worst. That's maybe somewhat noticeable as a brief hitch, sometimes to some people, but not in a game-ruining way like we've seen in the case of older CPUs. With that line thoroughly drawn, the differences to spot with the 10600K is that its frame-to-frame deviation is much more consistent. Standard deviation is down to 0.96 milliseconds from 1.93 on the 4790K. The maximum value is 12.7. The minimum value is down 1 millisecond to 5.2, and the average frame time is 7.1 milliseconds from 9.9. More importantly, the maximum frame-to-frame deviation is 12.7 milliseconds to 5.5, which is a range of 7.2. Most of the best gamers won't notice that, but it's getting close to being maybe noticeable by some really high-level players. Most people who claim they can see this type of difference could likely be fooled in a double-blind test and inaccurately or inconsistently identify that difference. This is what people experience when they move from an old CPU to a new one though. The 10600K is significantly improved, as indicated by the sheer height of the bar-to-bar differences, and that's also shown when we plot the 3700X. In an objective sense, the 10600K technically maintains more consistent frame times and a higher average FPS here. But in a useful sense, both are significantly better than the older CPUs like the 4790K. The 3700X has a standard deviation of 1.1 milliseconds, a max of 15 milliseconds, a min of 5.6, and an average of 7.9. Again, in a purely objective sense, not one of these metrics is better or smoother than the 10600K. In a practical sense, it doesn't actually matter, and ultimately, both would be perceived as, again, quote-unquote smooth, especially as compared to upgrades from older CPUs. Here's a chart recapping the frame time values. The core concept is this: don't misattribute an overall uplift in system-to-system improvement to just the CPU alone, especially without comparative data to multiple modern CPUs. We've proven all of this in the past, but this helps to put it in more definitive terms to explicitly address where people tend to see an improvement when moving from an old computer to a new one. Another common reason people misattribute the improvements they feel is because of an OS update. We saw this with, say, the 8700K when people moved to the 3000 series, because the 8700K is still objectively superior in frame-to-frame intervals versus the 3000 series CPUs in nearly all instances. That's not to say the 3000 series isn't good or isn't smooth, or even that the difference is necessarily meaningful, just that we shouldn't make things up about AMD's CPUs when they're already good enough without telling fairy tales. Anyone on an upgrade path like this may have felt like they had an improvement from the OS refresh, which slows with age, and that'd be more likely than from the CPU change. We can show this easily with some of our data from previous benchmark suites. The first set of data is from a bloated MSI laptop benchmark we did years ago, where we tested the laptop with its included 11 control panels and other bloatware versus a wiped clean version. The bloated test is a good representation of how systems age, since a lot of computers slowly accumulate background software as they get older. This chart shows the frame time variance in Black Ops 3, relevant at the time, where we saw occasional and repeatable 100 millisecond spikes in frame times randomly during gaming. This would happen when one of the many background processes fired off or pinged Windows. In this other example of bloatware from 2016 laptop testing that we did, we found that systems with bloated operating environments, which would be similar to a simulation of aging of sorts, to have performance losses up to 40% in average FPS. We'll roll through a few of those FPS charts now. Even if you're careful to avoid accumulating software over 4 or 5 years of use, and even if you're more of a power user who just doesn't need that software, it's still possible that regular small updates to software you do need or to Windows, just like on a phone, could contribute to system slowdown from its initial clean state because you're upgrading in place rather than installing fresh. Most people would probably resolve a lot of their perceived smoothness issues by installing a new operating system on their same computer. More recently, we've produced benchmarks showing the impact of RGB software on system performance, both individually, down to the IQ or the CAM level standalone, and in combination with each other. If you have a few RGB components in one system, but not in the upgrade, it would also be feasible to see a disproportionately high improvement in system performance when comparing two otherwise completely clean operating systems against each other. We've been rotating through a few of those charts to prove that point as well. But that's enough to show where improvements can come from, aside from just the CPU upgrade. So now we can get into the Intel versus AMD modern comparisons for what does just the CPU upgrade do in a controlled environment. We'll start with one of the most favorable comparisons for AMD, just to establish the baseline for reality early. Here's the FPS chart. Before getting into frame times individually, we're going to start by narrowing in on the 10600K and 3700X, which sell within about $10 of each other. We'll be showing both with identical memory configurations and without any overclocking, so everything's fair. Before anyone says anything, overclocking would also disproportionately favor Intel, not AMD, as we've shown in the past. But the real problem is that overclocking gets into stability territory where it might increase the average FPS, but not always the frame time consistency, and it just becomes very difficult to show in objective benchmarks. So those numbers are up here too, but we're gonna focus on the stock numbers. Here's the frame time chart. The Intel i5 10600K runs between 6 milliseconds and 9 milliseconds on average, with occasional spikes toward 20 to 23 milliseconds. This is common with our Hitman 2 benchmark and occurs in all of these CPUs at some level. We saw that in the 0.1% average reflected previously. This behavior was appearing pretty much universally in this game. Overall, frame-to-frame deviations are low and controlled, and the 10600K averaged 72 FPS 1% and 46 0.1%. Both of those numbers are above the 65 FPS 1% and 40 FPS 0.1% of the 3700X. Although the 1% and 0.1% numbers are more naturally prone to variation and averaging because there's fewer of them to work with, it's still averaged against thousands of data points per test. So with multiple test passes for each CPU, we're working with tens of thousands of data points per component. And that's not even counting the overclock or the follow-up testing that we do every couple months. The 3700X does well also, occasionally spiking to 25 to 26 milliseconds, and both CPUs are what we would call an objectively good performance. In average FPS, the 10600K stock leads by about 9% over the 3700X. Whether or not that's meaningful to you is mostly a subjective and personal matter, but it does mean that the 10600K is objectively better in this task. Whether or not that matters, different story. In frame times, we see that it is also objectively quote-unquote smoother, at least what people think they mean when they say smoother. Now, this doesn't actually matter in this instance, and you should really be basing the purchase of the CPU on whether you're only gaming or whether you're mixing in heavier workloads with high regularity, like compression or render tasks, where you'd start leaning AMD anyway. If you're just trying to argue on the internet about Ryzen being smoother, it objectively is not. But the two are functionally equal in frame time consistency as far as a player is really concerned, and in absolute terms for this title. So again, there's no reason to make things up. Ryzen is plenty competitive here, and we don't have to pretend like the R5 3600 or R7 3700X are doing something that the 10600K doesn't. All of them do it well. Intel technically leads though. But that will change once we look at the lower end stuff in a moment. There's no magical frame time lead just because it's named Ryzen, and that's even with a core advantage here. We'll quickly look at the two $500 CPUs as well. The 10900K and the 3900 XT are plotted next, and here the 10900K has similar spikes to the previous sets, but the impact of those is minimized against the greater data set. The 10900K stays below the 3900 XT across the benchmark, and the 3900 XT's excursions from the mean go to greater heights than the 10900Ks. Keeping in mind that most people can't identify frame time deviations this low, both of these CPUs are objectively consistent in intervals, at least as far as this game allows, and both of them are fine. The 10900K is also technically superior once again. It's no surprise, seeing as its average is 141 FPS to the 3900XT's 124, and with CPU testing, it's often really as simple as the higher the average, the higher the lows. But once you look at older architectures, that stops being true. This discussion really got going in the 8700K era. If you'd forgotten, Intel didn't actually start getting smacked around hard until the 3000 series came out. When the 8700K launched, it took nearly every single crown away from the 2700, even Blender. And that's really what we should all want to see in the market. We should want to see that back and forth, rapid launch cycle between each company where both are taking victories from the other. Even still, people were arguing in favor of the 2700 being allegedly smoother. We see here, again, that this isn't true. The end result of this frame time plot was 96 FPS average, 53.1%, and 34.01% on the 2700, or 122, 70 FPS, and 44 FPS, 0.1%, on the 8700K. The 8700K therefore held a lead of 27% in average FPS and was technically, again, better in the lows. There's one place where it does tip back into AMD's favor, but it didn't really start happening until May this year. The R3 3300X does tip the scale in its favor for an objective advantage in so-called smoothness. Dollar for dollar, this makes the most sense to match the 10100 for a head-to-head comparison between two companies. We'll show the 2666 and the standardized 3200 memory speeds for the 10100, given the unlikely pairing with a Z490 board, so this gives you both sets to work with. The 10100 stock CPU plots several spikes and runs overall around the 7 to 12 millisecond range. The R3 3300X runs below 10 milliseconds here, on average, and has consistent frame-to-frame timing. Spikes are present, as with all CPUs in this title, but not excessive. The 10100 at 2666, assuming a more appropriate motherboard with it, suffers in a significant way when squashing its spikes. Even in the best case scenario though, AMD is smoother here, as people say. So the lower end comparison is where the statement would be true. We pointed this out in our 3300X review as well, and that's when we said it's no longer an i5 is enough for gaming, it's an R3 is enough for gaming. That said, people normally apply this idea of the AMD CPU having objectively shorter amplitude in the frame-to-frame pacing as something that applies towards all of the R5 or R7 or other CPUs, even though in those instances, as we just showed, it's not higher than Intel. F1 2019 is next in the average FPS chart. The 10600K outdoes the 3700X by about 8.4% in average FPS, but also maintains a technical lead in 1% lows. But at this range of results, the 1% low number is functionally equivalent. We don't really have the test resolution to determine a difference between these two numbers at this high of a frame rate. The average is determinable, but the low values are too close to call given the reduced precision in low frame time measurements. Here's the frame time plot of the 106 versus the 3700X. First, notice that our scale is only 0 to 12 milliseconds on the left, so we're at a point where any excursions are going to be irrelevant and unnoticeable to the player anyway. There are a few of them for each CPU, but they're just not at this scale going to matter much. The 10600K runs below the 3700X line overall, as you'll notice, and has tighter frame-to-frame consistency overall, but not in a way which is appreciable to the player. If we did double-blind tests on these, again, it's unlikely most people would be able to accurately determine which was which. The average is higher, yes, but you wouldn't be able to tell purely from a smoothness angle. You wouldn't see any hitches or stuttering in either of these scenarios. Maybe you could see the average FPS change, but that's not our focus today. In this situation, the Intel CPU is objectively smoother. But before someone points out that 11 millisecond frame time, note first that the 3700X has more overall excursions. And these, like that 11 millisecond frame time, are also irrelevant. But if you're going to make a mountain out of that molehill, you should at least do it for both. Separately, we could plot multiple passes for each, and they'd trade these spikes, so it just doesn't matter. One frame out of 6,000 in this limited x-axis, spiking by 5 milliseconds just doesn't matter to anybody, nor will it be noticed. Same for AMD's spikes here. Here's the R3 3300X and the i3 10100 chart again, where we'll see the same thing repeated as in Hitman. In a purely technical sense, which is the only thing we care about when correcting a widespread internet misconception, AMD's $120 CPU is actually objectively lower in frame times, and more consistent in frame-to-frame pacing when compared to Intel's $120 CPU. That's true even when Intel is at equal memory settings on a Z490 board. The Intel CPU plots fine overall, and the experience on all of these is objectively playable in the very least. We're in the hundreds of frames per second area, after all, with F1 2019, and so it's hard to complain about the performance of most of the CPUs we've tested. There's one spike to about 24 milliseconds, and that was reproducible in most of the test passes on the 10100. But still, not the worst spike we've seen. Definitely noticeable, but it only happens once. AMD's 3300X didn't encounter that spike in this specific run, but it did have one to 16 milliseconds in one of the other passes. The 3300X runs lower than the 10100 here, and you could fairly state that it is reduced in duration for the average frame-to-frame interval. We wouldn't use the phrase smoother in any of these, at least not yet, seeing as that sort of implies a human perceptible difference. In reality, the correct phrasing that people think they want to use is that the average frame-to-frame interval is reduced or more consistent. There isn't some magic to the core count either. There's more to architecture and these CPUs overall than just the core count. Back when people said the 2700 was allegedly smoother than the 8700K because it has 2 physical cores more than the 8700K did, that really wasn't a valid reason even for an imaginary advantage. In this chart, the 8700K runs below 5 to 6 millisecond frame times and is tightly clustered in a range of plus or minus 1 millisecond. The 2700 is marginally less consistent, not in a way that particularly matters strictly from a frame pacing standpoint, but certainly one which isn't accurately described as being better than the 8700K in any way whatsoever. The 8700K is just objectively superior here. Assassin's Creed is interesting since it loads cores heavily, but also has instances of reduced core load in favor of higher single-thread or limited-thread workloads. It's a balanced workload. Although it's less fair price to price for Intel, just to sort of prove the point, we'll take the 10600K at $290 and compare it to the 3800 XT at $500, and then overclock the 3800 XT to 4.6 GHz all-core while running the 10600K stock. In averages, the result is 128 FPS average for the 10600K, 95 1%, and 86 FPS 0.1%, with the 3800 XT OC at 124 FPS average, 89 1%, and 76 0.1%. In this frame time plot, the experiential result is about the same. It's unlikely most people would notice a difference in average FPS of 4 anyway, but even the frame time difference is in that too close to tell territory. And we should remind everyone here too that FPS comparisons aren't about just absolute numbers that you see in reviews, it's about a percentage difference, and that's where you should really be looking, but for purposes of this content we're deviating a bit from what we normally talk about. In the purest technical sense, Intel's frame times do average out to be lower, and are marginally less variable frame to frame. But we're talking 1 millisecond deltas here. It's repeatable, and it absolutely is not within error. But it also isn't particularly relevant. It's not accurate to call AMD smoother either. And the most frustrating thing that we see is people referencing our own charts in comments and then misrepresenting them by allowing their own confirmation bias to affect their ability to remember that the number 95 is larger than the number 86. While we're at it, we might as well squash 2 misconceptions with this one. Although not as common as the Ryzen is smoother nonsense, we also saw some people upset that the Intel i5-10400 isn't, quote, getting enough credit as compared to the R5-3600, with those people often claiming that it is noticeably better. That's not really true universally, especially when you actually run it with memory that makes sense for the CPU, but we don't need to go back down that path that we beat to death in our extreme memory tuning benchmarks with the 10400, where we used CL10 or 11 memory in order to prove the point. In the Assassin's Creed data set that we have, the 10400 had about a 4 FPS average advantage over the R5-3600 when both had the memory speeds set equal, assuming a Z490 motherboard for the i5 CPU. The AMD R5-3600 and the Intel i5-10400, therefore, ran at about the same frame times. The 10400 was marginally better, about 1 to 2 milliseconds tighter frame to frame on average. Just like in the previous charts about Ryzen not being smoother though, the i5-10400 likewise is not smoother here in any meaningful way. If we plot the 2666 numbers, the 10400 does become objectively worse in a way which is noticeable in play, but ultimately, like for like, it's in that same territory as the others before, where the difference is somewhat debatable in value, but is technically present in numbers. We've mostly proven the point by now. Again, it's not the objective to tear down Ryzen. Certainly we've recommended it enough recently that our credentials support we're out for the best interests of each type of user. Our goal is to set expectations. Ryzen is good enough without fabricated stories. Intel is leading in gaming, and Ryzen isn't. It also isn't magically lower frame time, or variance of frame times, just because of the name. The only time we see Ryzen pull ahead in a way that is meaningful and significant is in the lower end market, where you look at the $120 CPUs or the $100 CPUs, where the 3300X does hold a lead over the 10100 and is a much better buy than the 10100 is, if you don't need an IGP anyway. But we already told everyone all of this, and we already told everyone not to buy the 10100 unless you really need that IGP. So that's not what people mean, though, when they call Ryzen smoother, because this has been going on for generations. Despite the fact that it makes for a convenient straw man argument that the R3 CPUs are, in fact, superior to the Intel i3 CPUs right now, what most people are talking about is the higher end stuff, or at least the mid-range. Finally, our goal today, as stated earlier in this content, wasn't to look at so-called multitasking benchmarks. That's another can of worms entirely that we've already covered in the past, primarily on low-end CPUs from Intel and AMD, where you'd see the biggest difference. The goal today was just to look at simply the phrase of smoother as it applies to CPUs, where, as we can see in like-for-like scenarios, it's not really as it's been represented on the internet. Mostly what people see an improvement from is old to new. But we've been showing some of the multitasking benchmarks we did in the past, just as an example of what those look like, and you'd have to read the content for the methodology on that one. As a general reminder, if the word multitasking to you means that you have a couple of Chrome tabs, maybe YouTube, and maybe Discord in the background, unless you're on these Pentium class CPUs, that doesn't really count. To actually make an impact on gaming performance, you'd have to do something like streaming at the same time, playing a game, and maybe allocating some cores to rendering a video, doing compression or decompression while playing a game, stuff that actually impacts things more than just Chrome, which is more memory bound anyway, or some sort of other simple background task like instant messaging tools. So again, that's pretty much all there is to it. The statement Ryzen is smoother, or Ryzen has 8 cores and 16 threads, therefore is smoother, is just objectively false. It's not that simple. There are instances where AMD Ryzen CPUs are smoother, in big air quotes there. I actually hate that phrase for it, but that's also one that people kind of understand, so we use it. But there are instances where Ryzen CPUs, like the 3300X, or like new Ryzen CPUs versus older Intel CPUs, are in fact more consistent in frame time delivery and less variable in frame-to-frame interval or pacing or whatever smoothness phrase you want to use. Those instances have been shown. So 3300X versus the price equivalent Intel CPU, absolutely from the beginning we've been saying the 3300X makes the most sense. It is, in fact, enough for gaming for a lot of people. And that's kind of taken the place of where the i5 was, and as we saw, it took several years before the i5 started to really lose an edge versus the i7s. For that advantage the i7 had in threads to materialize took a few generations of software updates. So the R3 is in that position now where the i5 used to be, which is a great spot for AMD. The higher end stuff, the mid-range stuff, price for price, it is not objectively smoother, at least in the benchmarks we've looked at today. There are also instances where when GPU bound, which we didn't show on this, but we have that data in previous videos for CPU reviews we've published that you can look at compatible. GPU bound scenarios where AMD has some extra overhead, so it doesn't have quite the same peak performance or peak average performance as Intel, and in those cases, even being GPU bound, it is not objectively smoother. Now, that said, as we showed in this content, a lot of the times where Intel has better frame pacing, price for price, it's not like it's necessarily something you'll even notice. It's just that it's still wrong to say that the AMD Ryzen part is somehow more consistent in frame time pacing for those games that we showed. There are likely some applications out there where it may be more in favor of one than the other, but for the most part, these are going to be about the same price for price, with a couple exceptions that we talked about in the content. So to recap then, we're not trying to minimize the improvements of Ryzen or the places where it makes sense to buy. And unfortunately, I have to put all these qualifiers in these types of videos because of past experience with the AMD rabid fan base. And if you ask other YouTubers, they'll say the same thing. So the qualifiers then, before people are upset that we're not making their specific use case out to be the best thing ever, the qualifiers would be that with the AMD Ryzen CPUs, we've recommended them heavily in most of our recent reviews. Someone who goes back and pulls up the XT reviews would be like, oh, these guys are Intel shills. The fact of the matter is, look at some of our Intel reviews too. So 3600, still one of the, actually especially one of the absolute best values on the market right now. It's down to about 160 bucks these days. That's crazy for what it is. Really good value. Doesn't have limited memory speed issues like the non-Z490 motherboards that Intel faces with 10400s, for example. The 3700X actually was a CPU we didn't really like originally for its positioning, but now it's worked its way into our favor because of its new price point, so that's a good option too. And then the 3900X is a good option if you don't really care that much about gaming, but you want a whole lot more out of the workstation side. Intel, the i5-10600K, is just objectively the best gaming CPU you can get anywhere near its price right now. And it's also extremely tunable. It's really fun to work with for overclocking. Great option for people who only care about gaming. 10900K, kind of different price territory. We wouldn't buy it over a 3900X for workstation stuff in the most use cases, but if you're an absolute frame snob, then sure, that's kind of your option. So as you can see, pretty even split between them, but universally, Ryzen is in fact not, quote, smoother than Intel. It is more consistent in frame times in some instances at the lower end, but that's pretty much where it stops. So everybody please stop universally stating this phrase and add the correct qualifying statements to it when you do use it. That's it for this one. We have a couple more angles to this we can look at, like input latency, for example. Another topic, another time. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.